sometimes, I mean, my experience in doing interviews is that once you ask once, fine, twice, fine, three times, if you don't get a clear answer, that's kind of your answer.
Dana Bash is CNN anchor, chief political correspondent. She hosts Inside Politics on weekdays and co-anchors State of the Union on Sundays. Dana, thanks so much for coming on Press Club.
It's great to be here. This is a great setup.
Thank you.
I'm comfy. I might not ever leave this chair.
I know you're used to cable news studios,
Yes.
which are a little bit more upright, I feel.
Yeah, this is like, definitely made for staying a while.
Yeah, great, perfect. Well, let's get into it. I want to talk about your interview with Vice President Kamala Harris and her running mate, Tim Walz. You secured the first interview with them since she ascended to the top of the ticket, and it created a lot of conversation. What were your impressions of Harris and Walz in that interview?
My impression was that these are two people who are still in the early days of their relationship, trying to figure out, and in the early days of their candidacy, each of them trying to figure out how to navigate it. Every day is like 12 news cycles, and it's been like that for the past 8 years. But it's easy to quickly forget that even though she has been vice president for almost 4 years, and she has been in public service, she was obviously a senator, AG, so on and so forth. This is the kind of thing when you run for president that once you get to this time in the calendar, you have been through your paces.
Right.
And you have your reps, whether it is, well, first of all, you have the votes from the people who are voting in your party. And the Biden-Harris ticket had the votes, but not her. But just in terms of what it takes to be a successful candidate, you have a lot of time, not just to sort of learn the performance and feel comfortable with doing an interview, which actually she did a lot more interviews during the Biden-Harris campaign than people realize, because she just did a lot of it under the radar.
And nobody really
and nobody was
focused
paying
on them
attention,
because
which
they were
is
all
what
paying attention to Biden.
Which is what you kind of want.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the policies, she's still quickly she was shot out of a cannon, so she's trying to figure out, what do I want to stick with him on, what do I not? She, for the most part, didn't want to have any daylight with Biden on policies, which I understand.
So the thing that stuck out to me most, and this might be a little harsh on Harris and Walz, but she seemed to have a hard time answering the obvious questions that she was going to get in this first interview. She struggled to say what she would do on day one. She had a sort of evasive answer when you asked her about fracking. And Walz, I thought too, his answer on suggesting that he had served in combat was sort of evasive. He said, "I speak candidly," which is obviously he didn't speak candidly. That was the whole problem. Did you get a sense that they were ready for these kinds of questions? And this is obviously Kamala Harris is going to have a debate next week with Trump. I feel like she's going to need to have better answers going forward if she has any chance of success.
Well, on fracking, if you just came from the moon and you say, why is she asking about this very specific, very sort of micro question, but we all know why I asked the question, because she has to win Pennsylvania, and this is like table stakes in Pennsylvania. I actually thought she was really clear. Like she said, I will not ban fracking.
Right.
What she was less clear about, and maybe what you're getting at, is how she got there.
Why she changed.
Yes.
Because you had to ask twice.
Yeah.
You had to ask multiple times questions twice, because the answers weren't necessarily answering the question. They were answering what they wanted the question to be, which is often what politicians do. But I don't know, it came off as a little evasive at times, I thought.
And that's why I wanted to ask the broader question, which is, if you've changed your position on X, Y, and Z, how can you assure voters that those positions won't change again once they elect you?
Right.
Which I do think, a lot of liberals are like, oh, you're asking Republican talking points. But that's like a fundamental question that if I'm a swing voter, I want to know the answer to. If I'm not sure if I'm going to vote for Trump or Harris or not vote at all, that's something that will inform my vote.
There's also a difference between what every candidate in the history of American politics has done, which is run to please a base in a primary
Yeah.
and then move to the center in a general election. Harris's, the way she ran in 2020 feels, and the way she's running now, feels a little more extreme than that, I would say. Not extreme in terms of policy, just the turn is a little bit...
The differences?
Yeah.
And I think, again, this is in part because, well, there are two dynamics at play here. Number one, the 2020 Democratic race was in
Odd.
It was in the middle of George Floyd and
Right.
Black Lives Matter, and it was also after the Democrats did extremely well in the midterm before that, and elected a lot of very progressive, very liberal Democrats.
Right.
And so that's where the kind of zeitgeist was in the Democratic Party. I'm not defending it, I'm explaining it. And then you have Harris quickly have to absorb and be a part of not her own positions, but Joe Biden's, because he was the president. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's the contrasting where she has been with Joe Biden, who was elected because he wasn't like those other Democrats who were running against him. He was perceived as more moderate. You can argue whether he governed like that, but that's how he got elected. And she has been part of that administration. So trying to suss out what she would do now that she's the boss and now that she's in charge is really the key.
Yeah. Now, as is often the case these days, whenever there's a big high-profile interview like this, you took some heat from the left, as you noted, some heat from the right. What did you make of that criticism? I mean, the right, their problem was that you didn't necessarily, they felt, hold her down on some of her more nebulous policy positions. Mm-hmm. What would you say to that?
I think you just said, I tried.
Right.
I mean, you can't force somebody to answer a question. And I asked a follow-up. I tried to get more into the nitty-gritty and get the answer. And sometimes, I mean, my experience in doing interviews is that once you ask once, fine, twice, fine, three times, if you don't get a clear answer, that's kind of your answer.
Yeah, that was one of my next question, actually. How persistent do you feel like you should be in these kind of interviews where you're speaking with a vice president or a presidential candidate? Did you ask 10 times if you need to, or does it depend on the question?
It totally depends on the question, on the place you are in the calendar, on the importance of it. There are a million factors. It's really subjective, don't you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it depends on the question too.
Yeah.
I had Vivek Ramaswamy on this show a couple weeks ago, and he got very upset with me because I asked him about his book from 2 years ago where he said that Trump was a threat to democracy.
Yeah.
And it was 2 years ago. It's not that long ago.
No.
And he said, why are we talking about ancient history? And I kept asking about it, and he got very upset. That kind of thing, I think, is worth asking 10 times, until you get a straight answer. Other questions, like the questions that you had in the Harris interview, I don't think,
And
one
also,
or two follow-ups.
Well, and also people have to understand that you have a limited window of time.
Right.
And so you have to decide whether you want to just, throw everything out that you were planning, which is fine. I've done that many times. If you either hear something that you want to follow up on. Know that it could be the
end of the interview.
Yeah.
If you just keep asking it. Yeah.
Because you'll run out of time. But because this was, I viewed it as foundational because it was her first, hopefully not her last. I know she will do many others, but that I felt like I needed to have some touch points, some basic touch points on a few different issues. There definitely were hundreds of topics that I would have liked to have asked about. I just didn't have the time.
Now, just a little inside baseball here. How does an interview like this come together? Because obviously there's a lot of competition. Quickly, all of a sudden. I mean, every network was trying to get this interview. How did CNN get it? How did you get it?
I just like everybody else was lobbying for it. Yeah, I had interviewed her several times during. I covered her in the Senate. She wasn't there very long, but I did cover her there, and when she was running for president and was in the spin room after the debates in 2019 during the 2020 cycle. So I definitely have interviewed her many times. And then, and so I was pushing for it, and my network was pushing for it, and it just, I don't have the answer. I don't have the answer of how
Why you were chosen.
Why, but I'm not questioning it.
Now, obviously, there was a lot of pressure on Harris to do an interview, which he hadn't done until yours, and that pressure's, I assume, going to continue because we've got 66 days or so left. And do you think that the Harris campaign is going to continue to be at least interview averse going forward? And do you think that's a mistake for them?
I don't think that they're going to be interview averse.
Okay.
I don't, because I think that they understand and she understands that it's important. And now the focus is on the debate. They wanted to get one done before the debate. And, even though it seems like it was a very long time, and I think on paper, and it was many, many days between when she announced and when she secured the nomination, and those 24 hours, and she sat down for an interview, because of the unusual circumstances, you could make the argument, like if one was running her campaign, that the longer you wait, the higher the stakes.
Yes.
And just to have just done little ones, do local interviews,
Right.
They didn't do that for whatever reason. But I do think she'll do more.
Yeah. And Trump, obviously, have to be fair about this. I think people get the impression that he does a lot of press because he does a ton of interviews on podcasts that are very popular but that aren't with real journalists. Do you think he's going to sit down for an interview between now and the election, or does he just not have to because nobody in his audience cares? He can do the Fox phoners, he can do a Theo Vaughn interview, but he doesn't have to do CNN.
I think that the Trump campaign, and he understands that, he's got his base. He needs to broaden out.
Right.
And it's that push and pull between what his campaign wants him to talk about, policy, and what he actually says, which is some policy, but it gets drowned out by the other stuff that he says. But I take your point. I mean, yes, he does sit down and talk to people, but in some ways, maybe it's a bit of an unfair.
Right.
I don't want to call it a canard, but because we as reporters want them to sit down with reporters all the time. But it is true that there's an impression that he sits down with reporters maybe more than he actually sits down with people like you and me.
Right. I want to talk about the upcoming debate.
Okay.
And you obviously hosted the first CNN debate with Jake Tapper, which was probably the most consequential debate in a presidential cycle in recent memory. I can't think back to one that was more consequential. Just thinking back to that debate, and I know this is a little bit of an old question, but when you were watching what was happening up on stage, were you thinking...
What you were thinking?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Totally.
Joe Biden is...
what is happening?
Right.
What is happening? When we prepare for a debate, I'm sure ABC is doing the same thing. We do it for days and days, weeks and weeks.
Is it mind-numbing?
Yes, but that has a negative connotation.
Okay.
I find it fascinating.
So good mind-numbing.
Yes. I mean, the way I describe it is you're in a college seminar.
Okay.
And the professor's you're going to moderate a debate. Sit around and come up with the best questions, and then let's do it. Except we actually get to do it.
Right.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
Yeah.
And we have the best team. It's and this was true for the interview that I got. It's Marvel. It's the team assemble.
Yeah.
And we have all of our superhero characters, all
the Avengers.
The Avengers
of booking and production.
Production and questions and research, and we just assemble the whole Avenger team when we have the debates or big interviews, and it's a pretty remarkable slate of people who I get to work with to do it. And so on a debate, it's so much. We go through questions and different and variations of questions and topics, and you work through it, and we do mock debates. And
Who plays Trump and Biden in the mock debates?
Am I allowed to say that? No, I'm not allowed to say that.
Fine.
I don't want them to have issues.
Have issues, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now,
but they're awesome people.
Yeah, they're good?
Yeah, they're good.
Do they do the voices?
Sometimes.
Okay, sometimes.
Yeah.
Good. Do you have any advice for ABC and their moderators that are hosting next week's debate?
I'm not so much in the advice business, but I would just say
Give them bad advice.
no,
if they perform
no.
worse. Yeah.
I want them to do well. But
Okay.
it's a privilege.
Yeah.
I know this is going to sound so corny, but it is such a privilege. And they know that. Lindsay and David are like pros.
Yeah.
And they understand that, and they understand the stakes, and just to kind of keep that in mind. And the way that Jake and I approached this debate and every other, this is only general election debate that we've done because of the change in the format, but all the primary debates, that it's not about us. It is about them.
Right.
And the more the story is about them and what they say and how they interact and less about us, that's when we do the best job.
Which is why you want to avoid live fact checking, stuff like that, because the
Then you're a participant.
Democrats don't always get, or were upset
Yes, they were.
at the lack of fact checking.
Yes, they
But
were.
It does insert the moderators into the debate more than you might have liked.
It does, and listen, they're judgment calls. But the way I and Jake and other people who do this kind of thing at CNN approach it is, when I'm doing an interview, I will fact check. It's my responsibility. Depending on who you're interviewing, it's not always easy when you're sort of drinking through a fire hose of things that you have to fact check, but you try. And a town hall, which we've done many of, when you have one-on-one and then you have the audience, you fact check. But a debate is a debate, and it's between candidate A and candidate B. So the way we went about it was, it's up to Joe Biden to fact check Trump, and it's up to Trump to fact check Joe Biden. And just imagine a world in which Trump gave his answer and we said, President Biden, just hold on a second. Before we get to you, we have to take 3 minutes to just talk about all
Throw
the
to
things
Daniel
that he
Dale
said.
And,
Yeah, it's then we are participants
Right.
in the debate. We're moderators for, facilitators for, and especially given the way the debate went down, think about what you would have been writing about had we interfered.
And I don't think any
Or
amount of
interjected, not interfered.
any amount of fact checking would have saved Joe Biden from that performance. I think
Yeah.
people wanted to blame a lack of fact checking for that, but that wasn't the issue.
No.
What do you think we can expect from Trump and Harris on Tuesday?
I don't know. I'm excited to see.
Do you think Trump's going to be able to maintain discipline as he did in the CNN debate?
Well, the rules are on his side now because
Right.
the mic
I love
situation.
that his campaign pushed for muted mics, knowing that the only reason they're doing it is so that he keeps his
Because
mouth
they
shut.
didn't realize, nobody realized that it was the Biden campaign that
They
wanted
asked for
that.
those muted mics. Yeah.
Because they wanted,
Which was a mistake, because if you watch the Chris Wallace debate from 2020,
Mm-hmm.
the whole reason that Biden won that debate is because Trump could not help but scream over him.
yep. Well, and what was the line?
One of the reasons.
What was the line that Biden used? He said, not "come on, man." He said, okay, it's
forget.
gone. But
Okay.
anyway, he said, would you just shut up, man?
Yes, exactly.
I feel like that was game changing.
Game changing. He looked like the adult in the room.
And that was not a moment that could happen with Trump's mic muted.
Yeah.
Which the Harris campaign realized, obviously, after watching
3
the
minutes
debate that
in.
we were in. But as you said, Trump's campaign, they want those, it's forced discipline for him.
Right. Your new book, America's Deadliest Election, it's a very timely release, I feel, now that we're in a current election which has been had its own share of violence. And it tells this fascinating and dramatic history of a couple elections in Louisiana, and things turned bloody. To start, tell us why you wanted to write this book and what story you wanted to set out to tell when you did.
I wanted to write this book because Dan Abrams told me to.
How did that happen? Because I like that there's actually
it sounds like a line, but it actually is true.
there's a Mediaite tether to this story.
Very
which is cool.
tethered.
Yeah.
VDA kind of birthed this story.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Dan Abrams has written several books with my co-author, David Fisher, and somehow Dan came across this story, and he reached out to me, he reached out to David, and said, this is something that you should do together because it's less sort of law and order and other topics, even though he writes about a lot of different subject matters. This was obviously clearly like political and election related. And I said, I'd never written a book, been a part of a book, authored a book, nothing before. I thought about a lot of different ideas and never really settled on anything. And then when it like quite literally fell in my lap, I said, okay, I would love to do this. And I felt, had you heard about, like, did you learn about this election in school?
No, I did not.
Okay. Isn't that kind of amazing?
It's
I
the
didn't either.
craziest story that I've never heard of.
Right.
Yeah.
I grew up in New Jersey, went to public school there. What about you?
I went to public school on Long Island
Okay.
briefly and then abroad. So.
Okay. Well, abroad you have an excuse.
A little plausible deniability.
You definitely do. I do not, and I've talked to people even today and discussing the book a lot who grew up in Louisiana, went to school in Louisiana, and even they did
Wow.
not learn this. I'm sure they learned some version of it, but not the way that we're able to tell the story in the book. And the reason why it is so crazy is because it is America's deadliest election, because hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people died because of the chaos and fraud and real chaos and real corruption around the gubernatorial election of 1872 in Louisiana, which was certainly contained to that state, but the ramifications of what happened there were not only felt nationwide, but are still, the effects of it are still felt today.
Right. And just to get into a little detail about what happened. So there are these two candidates, a Republican and a Democrat, that are duking it out for this race. Both declare victory. What happens after that?
And then we should also, because today's sensibility, when you say Democrat and
Right.
Republican,
Different
you think
parties.
about, well, you just flip it. Just flip the script and think about Democrats were the segregationists, and they're the ones who came out of the Confederacy and really wanted the Confederacy to still be a thing. And Republicans were the party of Lincoln.
Yeah.
So, people need to think of it that way. And what happened was nobody would concede, because each said, we believe that if the votes were counted properly, if people were able to vote that they were allowed the way that they were allowed to or should have been allowed to, without intimidation, without being completely marginalized, then I would have won. And the same went for the other candidate. Because nobody would concede, both governors were inaugurated by their own people, and they claimed that they were the true governor. There were two legislatures that were sworn in. There were two slates of judges that were impaneled. And this went on for months and months and months. Finally, the federal government, through Congress, with all kinds of investigations and commissions and so forth, decided that it was, in fact, the Republican who was the governor. But the Democrats never accepted that. And during this whole time of real tumult, the leaders didn't just say, okay, well, let's just count the votes. They, particularly the Democrats, they stoked violence and they encouraged violence, chaos in the streets. They wanted that to be the sensibility of the election. And it was. There was chaos, there was violence in the streets of New Orleans. And outside of New Orleans, the real unbelievable tragedy was something called the Colfax Massacre, which happened in Grant Parish, a parish that was added into Louisiana, named for Ulysses S. Grant. And 150 black men were murdered, slaughtered, really in cold blood. And part of the question, and it was all about the vote, and the question was, how was there going to be justice? And it was decided that the federal government would try the case as part of the new civil rights related constitutional amendments that were passed after the Civil War. And it went all the way up through the courts. The Supreme Court made a decision that turned out to be monumental, called Cruikshank, which said that the civil rights of Americans needs to be decided not by the federal government, but by the states. And it was that decision, which came from this election, 1872 in Louisiana, that ushered in Jim Crow, because the southern states said, great, we're in charge of civil rights. Well, guess what? blacks aren't going to have very many.
Right.
And it lasted for a century.
Yeah. Now, there's obviously a lot of similarities between an election fight like that and what we're seeing today. What were the most striking parallels that you saw when you were reporting out this book and researching the history of it between what we're dealing with today?
Well, there was just the electoral tumult and the everything from at the ballot box, election workers being intimidated, voters being intimidated based on race. But there are also so many parallels when it comes to the characters.
Right.
There's the sort of main character who was the governor, who was a Republican governor, and he was beloved by the new black voters for a bit until he changed his tune and his party, Governor Henry Warmoth. And his characteristics are so, they kind of jump off the page at how familiar they are. He was incredibly charismatic, very open about the fact that he just wanted power. The people who loved him would do anything for him. The people who hated him, really hated him. And he felt like the tools of government and the construct of government was there for him and to keep him in power. And he changed it in order to keep himself in power.
Okay. So when you're looking towards today and we're looking towards an election now, obviously in 2020 there was a dispute over the election.
There was?
Yeah.
Oh.
It happened.
Oh.
We're going to get it again in 2024.
No
I think
question.
there's no question.
Yeah.
Did you see, when you were doing the research for this book, did you see any ways that, as a journalist, that you would prepare to cover something like the challenges that we're going to see in 2024?
Well, it's funny that you ask it that way, because I kept thinking, and I still think, I wish I knew about what happened, and we just talked about 1872. What happened in 1876, in many ways, was more relevant to 2020 and 2021. Because
Tell us about that.
Because it was about the presidential election, which was a mess. And the reason it was a mess is because Louisiana and 3 other states, they still had the problems that I just described. And nobody could make any conclusions about who was the Republican elected from that state. So
at least we figured it out in 2020.
Yes, exactly.
We got there.
Well, we did, and it was fact-based.
Right.
But then it
There's
was
still
like,
some,
people who don't believe it, but then it was really unclear because it was such a mess. And so Louisiana, for example, sent 2 slates of electors to Congress for them to figure out what to ratify. And there was a discussion about whether the vice president who was overseeing the Electoral College certification had the authority to choose, or whether it was ceremonial. That actually happened.
Wow.
And we learned a little bit about this, in the aftermath of January 6, 2021, but had I known really that this was an active debate, and by the way, the decision was the vice president doesn't have that authority, that it was simply ceremonial. But what happened—
Good to know that we figured that out
100 years. Yeah, exactly. Which Mike Pence obviously
knew.
He got the memo,
right?
Literally.
Yeah.
So it turned out that they just threw out 4 states' votes, and that added up to an electoral college tie. And they had to figure out, how are we going to pick a president? So they did what government officials do. They came up with a commission. And the commission had all kinds of toing and froing and back and forth, as you can imagine, because they tried to make it nonpartisan, but that's nearly impossible. But in the end, it effectively came down to one single man deciding who the president was going to be on that commission, and decided it was Rutherford B. Hayes. And it wasn't that simple, of course, because there was, as part of that decision, there was a kind of a backroom deal that happened at a restaurant. And that deal was that the federal government would bring troops out of the South. Because I mentioned that the Supreme Court decision dictated what the laws were and what the federal government could and couldn't do with regard to civil rights. But Grant President Grant, still a lot of the book is like him going back and forth about whether to put federal troops in the South in order to protect or to keep the peace and to protect the black citizens, or to pull them out, and what the decision to give Hayes the presidency came along with, even though he was a Republican and he was very much in the party of Lincoln, he agreed in order to get the presidency that he would pull the federal troops out.
Wow. You know, one of the useful things about reading history books like this, I find, is that it gives you a historical perspective on something that we often think about, current events that we often think about in very narrow terms because we're so up close with them. Did it give you a different perspective about the threat that Trump poses potentially to democracy, both in 2020 and potentially in 2024, if he again tries to say that the election was stolen from him?
I mean, absolutely. It gave me a different perspective in a lot of ways, but it was a reminder that we were all saying in 2020 and the beginning of 2021 that the institutions, what happened was such a reminder that the institutions of government and all of the checks and balances and the rules are mostly rules. A lot of it is not law. It's just kind of based on people doing the right thing.
And you hope that Republican election officials in Georgia and Arizona...
which they did.
They did.
Which they did. But not everybody did. And so it is a reminder that the guardrails aren't that high. Still, they changed some of the laws even after 1876. And we do know that some of the laws were changed statewide because states still control the elections after 2020. And that's something that I think, have not been maybe focused enough on. The Arizona law changed. The Georgia law changed. And for example, in Georgia, not unlike what this Governor Wormuth did back in the 1870s by accumulating power and knowing that they called it the returning board, which is like the canvass board, the people who are in charge of counting and certifying the elections. He stacked it. He made sure that it was done the way he needed it and wanted it to be. And it's sort of a variation of that. But the Georgia law, I mean, everybody sees Larry David and Curb Your Enthusiasm and the satire he did with the water. But there are other changes in the law, the ballot box, access to the ballot box, where the ballot boxes are going to be, so on and so forth. But it's also, one big change was Brad Raffensperger, who's still in that job as Secretary of State. They gave the legislature more power to decide who actually is going to be certified. And we covered it, like I think I was part of I did a whole hour on it, on the voting changes after 2020. But I feel like we've had so much change and so much news in the actual race that maybe we haven't focused enough on that kind of stuff. And as we enter into the fall, I feel like maybe we should.
My last question, your interview with Harris and Walz got 6 million viewers, big audience.
Oh.
Did that give you some hope for the future of cable news? There have been a lot of dour headlines in the last couple of years about how the audience is getting smaller, but CNN still pulls 6 million people to watch a presidential interview. Does that make you optimistic about its future?
Sure.
Okay.
I think it makes me it makes me more optimistic. Again, this is going to sound so corny. Maybe I'm stopping myself from saying it, but it makes me more optimistic about our electorate.
Okay. They tune in.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not just TikTok.
It's not just TikTok, and it's not just sports, which I love.
Right.
I mean, I'm down to watch the football game or the baseball game, usually forced upon me by my 13-year-old son, but I'm excited to be a part of it with him. But lately, and you cover this all the time, it's the events that tend to be sports, except for like a debate or a convention that drive viewers back to cable or to a live situation. The fact that this was a political interview and not the Olympics was pretty cool.
Bodes well.
Yeah.
Dana Bash, thanks so much for coming on the show.
It was so great to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
Of course.